You're on.
Okay.
I know. It's interesting. I had a lot of trouble myself when I settled down.
Oh, wow.
You can read from there.
Okay. The cones, according to the duplicity theory, have a special function in creating sensations of hue in daylight, or during photophilic vision. As we have noted, the cones are tightly packed, especially in the foveal region, and so they are also responsible for our distinct vision, partly explaining why visual activity is at a maximum under daylight illumination levels rather than at twilight. During night vision, when the cones are inoperative, the point of sharp focus on the retina automatically shifts from the fovea to a region where rods are present. The exact mechanism of visual excitation is not completely understood. There is even the possibility that what is thought to be understood is incorrect. However, it is known that there are light-sensitive substances present in the retina which decompose photochemically. The ionic products of the decomposition acting indirectly as nerve activators, which create coordinated impulses that are sent to the brain via the optic nerve. One of the light-sensitive substances of the retina was discovered as far back as 1876 by Ball. This substance is known as visual purple or rhodopsin. It is a complicated protein, purplish in color, quickly bleaching when exposed to light. The visual purple is found in the rods and in other parts of the retinal layer, but not in the cones. Experimental evidence of a corresponding light-sensitive material in the cone is scarce. But comparatively recently it has been disclosed that a substance called iodopsin is present in them and may be responsible for their stimulation. Dr. Wald of Harvard has also isolated and identified 3 color pigments in the retinal cones, which no doubt are in some way connected with the photochemical cycle of vision. The pigments isolated by Dr. Wald are astacine, coloring pigment of a boiled lobster, xanthophyll, coloring matter in egg yolk, and carotene, the pigment of the carrot. These compounds are related to the vitamin A structure, which we shall see is of fundamental importance in the photochemical retinal process.
The Rationality of Pictorial Art, Paul L. Anderson. A great deal is written and printed in the photographic magazines about art, and the question of whether or not photography is a fine art medium. But these discussions are for the most part intensely biased, generally concern themselves with minor details and fail to touch the fundamentals. The basic questions of what pictorial art is, why it exists, and how it may be achieved. Not long ago I read such an article by a well-known photographer and writer on photographic topics, in which the author declared that photography is a greater medium of expression than painting, and that our modern photographers are as great artists as any of the world's famous painters. But it is noteworthy that of the points which he cited to prove the superiority of the camera over the brush, almost every one is an element which goes into the making of records rather than of works of art. As for his other claim, I recently had an opportunity of comparing some of the best of present-day photography with a number of paintings, not by the great masters Michelangelo, Da Vinci, Raphael, Rembrandt, Velázquez, but by good painters of our own era, Simons, Melchers, Hassam, Redfield, Blossom, Vogt, Carlson, and such men. And I can only say that anyone who thinks for a moment that our photographers can rival our painters in artistic skill and insight is totally lacking in that sensitiveness and appreciation without which no one can hope to understand great art. Photographers and writers on photographic subjects debate the question of the miniature versus the large camera, of anastigmats versus soft focus lenses, of purism versus controlled work, of chrobromide versus multiple gum printing, and they defend their pet dogmas quite as passionately as the churchmen of another day argued the question of whether the Christian cross should have all four arms equal in length or one longer than the others. And like the same churchmen, they fail to see that their dogmas are utterly superficial, that they have no material bearing on the great subject, and that the vital truth lies far deeper than the doctrines over which they argue. Perhaps a brief consideration of the fundamentals of pictorial art may clear our minds of the narrow dogmatism which too often obscures the larger, air-round purposes of the sincere graphic worker. Pictorial art is nearly the oldest form of human expression, following close on the heels of the spoken word and antedating by many thousands of years any attempt at a written language. As man emerged from the status of a lower animal, and through the slow process of evolution became a thinking one, almost his earliest effort was to convey thoughts and ideas to his fellow beings. Certain of the lower animals can transmit a limited range of ideas to their fellows through the medium of primitive sounds, and man, with his more highly developed vocal apparatus, gradually evolved from these sounds a spoken language, rude and limited at first, but growing in complexity with the growth of knowledge and experience. But this power of speech did not suffice. It was fugitive, and one of the basic instincts of the human being, an instinct which is closely bound up with all our progress, is to leave a permanent record of his observations, his ideas and his thoughts. So the primitive man, long before he had even learned to build a shelter for himself, invented pictorial art as a means of setting down his experiences and of recording the objects that he saw. And we find on the walls of caves very spirited drawings of the animals of 20,000 years ago, with vigorous pictures of the caveman hunting these creatures of a prehistoric day. To be sure, the prehistoric artist never invented salons and exhibitions. In fact, he seems to have in a measure shunned publicity, for some of his drawings are found in the walls of caves so remote from the sun that a spectator must creep on hands and knees for hundreds of yards in order to reach them. It has been humorously suggested that the Cro-Magnon draftsman chose these obscure workrooms so as to avoid the infuriating interruptions from which all creative workers suffer. But whatever his reason, the fact indicates that he was a true artist working for the joy of production rather than for the applause. Gradually, little by little, pictorial art threw off a branch in the form of literary art. The earliest written language consisted of pictographs, in which pictorial symbols, more or less simplified and conventionalized, were used to express ideas and to record facts. Some races, otherwise highly civilized, never progressed beyond this method of writing. And even today, thousands of years after the greatest of all inventions, that of the phonetic alphabet, the two branches are not entirely divorced, since we illustrate our books and we give word titles to our pictures. These two forms of art expression are thus seen to be closely akin, each having for its basic purpose the conveying of ideas or the recording of observations, and each achieving this end through the use of conventionalized symbols, which remind the spectators or the listeners of something that they have seen or heard. And for further resemblance, each works on a flat plane, being thus differentiated from that other development of expression, the glyptic art, which works in 3 dimensions. Slowly, through the centuries, it came to be recognized that, irrespective of the idea conveyed, some of the symbols invented by artists were more pleasing to the eye and to the ear than others. It is not known whether this is a matter of association or whether it depends on the relative ease with which the symbols are appreciated. Probably both elements enter into it. At all events, the fact remains, and so the question of beauty came to have weight artists finding that their pictures, their sculpture, and their writings were better liked and longer remembered, and that the ideas were more forcibly conveyed if they expressed themselves in terms of beauty rather than of mere literal representation. To be sure, these ideas of beauty are not constant, but vary from nation to nation and from age to age, which seems to indicate that they are chiefly based on association. However, they exist, and the artist who wishes his work to live does well to pay attention to them in constructing this picture or his poem. Still another factor in the development of the graphic arts came to be recognized, for it was found that a picture or a poem or a prose composition could do more than record objective facts or express the artist's appreciation of natural or ideal beauty. It could arouse an emotion. Many persons think of an emotional appeal as purely sensuous, and incorrectly use the phrase in this manner. But the word emotion implies the existence of an intellectual effect, and this intellectual element must be present if the picture is to touch the subjective rather than merely the objective realm. A picture which is no more than a factual record of outward appearances, however beautiful it may be, has failed of the highest expression possible to art. To summarize, then, a picture as we today understand the words or a statue can do three things. First, it can record objective facts. Second, it can be appealing to the senses simply through the abstract beauty. Third, it can arouse in the observer some emotion, thereby stimulating him to loftier thoughts and actions than he would otherwise entertain or perform. Of course, a work of art does not necessarily do all of these things by any manner of means. Some merely record facts, some record these facts in terms of beauty, and some fulfill the highest function of which a work of art is capable, in arousing a noble and elevating emotion in the spectator's mind. All three of these purposes are entirely proper and legitimate functions of art. In all probability, the Cro-Magnon artist was moved by nothing more than a most intense urge to record, as he saw them, the strength of the bison and terrifying bark of the woolly rhinoceros, or the rush and tumult of the hunt. Later, much later, came the desire to record facts in terms of beauty, a development whereof the so-called Venus de Milo is the apotheosis. This figure is not a Venus but a victory. It was the custom of the Greeks to record their successes in war by means of statues, called victories, and the unknown artist who carved this magnificent figure has obviously yet idealized it, for it would be almost, if not quite impossible, to find any living woman who should combine in one entity the glorious physical structure and the lofty intellectual development of that noble statue. And for the third use of graphic arts, we need go no further than the Italian painters of the Renaissance, who used their art to aid and reinforce the religious teachings of the day. Raphael's Madonnas and Michelangelo's Last Judgment in the Sistine Chapel are the very archetypes
The retina.
of this expression.
The retina envelopes almost the entire inner wall of the posterior chamber of the eye. It is in this part of the eye that light is registered, setting up nerve excitations which are transferred to the sensorial regions of the brain, where the stimulus is interpreted. The retina is a thin membrane of about 0.2 millimeter thickness, which light can traverse with ease. The microscope reveals that the thinness of the retina is no indication of its complexity, for at about 1,500 times the magnification, a transverse section may show up to 10 distinct layers. The function of the various layers is not too well understood, although each has been the subject of thorough study. Fortunately, a complete knowledge of all the retinal layers is not required for this discussion, but a few are of extreme importance. In Figure 3 is shown a simplified schematic drawing of the retinal layer. It can be seen that, contrary to one's expectation, the light of focus upon the retina must pass through the entire layer before reaching the elements of sensitivity. This fact seems to be no barrier to good vision, however. In the foremost posterior region of the retinal layer are situated the so-called rods and cones, both of which have been considered the receptors of the visual organ, although at least one outstanding authority claims that only the cones are recipient bodies. The rods are shaped like thin cylinders, while the cones are bulged at one end and taper off at the other. These sensitive elements are highly concentrated, but are not equally distributed over the entire retina. In the general region of sharpest vision, called the macula lucia, or yellow spot wherein is located the fovea centralis, the cones widely outnumber the rods. The number of cones in the macula has been estimated as approximately 150,000 per square millimeter. There are actually no rods to speak of in the macula, and so it is easy to calculate the probable diameter of the cones in this region as around 2.6 millimeters. Or no, 0.0026 millimeters. As counts are made farther and farther away from the foveal region, the number of cones per square millimeter decreases. The number of rods increases, and the total number of sensitive elements per unit area decreases. At the extreme periphery, the cones again become predominant. The cones also become larger outside the fovea. The total number of cones in the retina is of the order of 3 million, while, according to some estimates, there are up to 20 times this many rods. It will also be noted that the retina is depressed in the foveal region, but it is questionable whether the thinness of this portion of the retina can in any way account for sharp vision. Some hawks have much better vision than man, in spite of considerably thicker retinas. Since the retina covers the entire inner posterior wall of the eyeball, the angular scope of the human vision for both eyes is almost 180 degrees in the horizontal plane. One can test this by stretching his arm out sideways and observing the wiggling of a finger while looking straight ahead. The vision at such an acute angle is not distinct, but it does exist. Actually, the angle of a sharp vision is very small, since high visual acuity is limited to the tiny cone-packed oval-shaped fovea having the approximate dimensions of 0.24 millimeters by 0.3 millimeters. The angle subtended in sharp vision is about 1 degree. Beyond this, vision is indistinct, and for the eye to cover an area subtending an angle greater than 1 degree, giving the impression of sharpness, it must scan the area continuously, such as happens when viewing a motion picture screen in the theater. We are not conscious of the scanning operations and are led to believe that we have a wider field of sharp vision than is actual. The visual path. The excitations created photochemically in the receptors are conveyed through the retinal structure by a complex system of ganglion cells and nerve fibers. The cones of the minute fovea lead out to the optic nerve, bundled by single fiber. However, since the total number of nerve fibers in the optic nerve leading to the brain is only about 100,000, it is obvious that each of the several million light-sensitive elements does not have a one-to-one correspondence with the brain. Actually, large groups of rods and cones are connected to a single nerve fiber, and this is further complicated by a most intricate visual path through the retinal layers. This can perhaps help to explain why retinal stimulation at one point often gives rise to adjacent disturbances. Light action on the retina. Although the more classical and more widely acknowledged theory, the duplicity theory, states that both the cones and the rods respond to light stimuli, they are said to react quite differently in the most functional aspects. To begin with, according to this theory, the rods are very much more sensitive to light than the cones. and at very low levels of illumination. Only the rods will respond. These levels are lower than the so-called cone threshold, which is around 0.001 lumen per square feet. The absolute threshold below which even the rods are non-responsive is about 0.00001 lumens over square feet. At low illumination levels where rod vision is predominant, it is generally assumed that no hues can be seen. Thus the expression, "all cats are gray at night." This is known, however, as night vision or scotopic vision. However, in spite of the fact that this assumption is well rooted in the field of physiological optics, the reader is warned not to accept it by any means as final. Some evidence points to the fact that the rods are not recipient bodies at all, only the cones functioning in this capacity. The cones, according to the duplicity theory, have a special function in creating sensations of hue in daylight, or during photopic vision. As we have noted, the cones are tightly packed, especially in the foveal region, and so they are also responsible for our distinct vision, partly